You may be seated. What is up with that story from Genesis? I mean, I can go with stars in the sky and Abram believing God, but cutting animals in half and fiery, smoky pots floating around in the air? Aren't you glad I'm not going to act out that one? Well, the story actually began 3 chapters earlier in Genesis when God spoke to Abram, promising to bless the whole world through his descendants, of which there were none yet. And in today's episode, which is about 10 years after God's first visit, God appears to him again with the same promise. But this time, Abe's not quite as excited. He does not yet have any descendants, and he's in his mid-80s. So he's beginning to wonder what's going on, and he cries out to God, "Since you haven't given me any children yet, one of my servants is going to inherit all that I have," which is a not-so-subtle dig at God that he ain't keeping his end of the bargain. And God responds, "No, Abram, you will have children. Step outside, look up in the heavens, count the stars if you can, because that's how many descendants you're going to have." Scripture says Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Something about God's promise touched Abram's heart, and he believed it. And he said, "Yes, Lord." And God declared him righteous. Now, righteous does not mean perfect or always doing the right thing. Righteous means being in right relationship with God. God declared Abram righteous, which means even though Abram is still human, still imperfect, still a sinner, still not righteous in everything he did, God said, "Because you believe me, our relationship with each other is all it's supposed to be, which makes you righteous. You are my friend, and I am yours." Now, this story is a landmark of faith because it shows that our being right with God is not determined by what we do or by what we know, but rather by whom we know. That's God himself. Our part is to listen to God, to believe what he says, to accept his offer to be his friend. That's what makes us righteous, not what we do. God says to Abram, "Because you believe, you and I are good, and you get the God housekeeping seal of approval." And then God promises to give Abram the land of Canaan. Now, if Abram had just said thank you and gone home, everything would have been fine. But no. Abram, who just 2 verses ago believed God and was declared righteous, asked, "How do I know you're really telling me the truth?" Now, God's reply makes no sense to us. He says, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon." Now, here in the 21st century, we're thinking, okay, they did animal sacrifices in the Old Testament, so maybe Abram is supposed to do some kind of offering thing. But Abram doesn't do the usual sacrificial barbecue bit. Instead, he cuts the big animals in half and lays the pieces outside beside each other. He kills the birds but doesn't cut them in half. And then he spends the rest of the afternoon chasing away the buzzards. And when the sun goes down, he falls asleep in a thick, dreadful darkness. Now, most of us probably checked out somewhere along, "He cut the animals in half." Ew! But stick with me and let me give you a little history here. Now, back then, kings and their subjects had an agreement called a king's covenant. And the king promised to protect the citizens, and in return, the citizen promised to pay taxes, to obey the king, and to serve in the army if war broke out. As usual, the king got the better end of the deal. And as with all covenants, there was a ceremony to seal the deal. And in a king's covenant, the citizen would take some animals, cut them in half, lay the halves out side by side, and walk between the pieces. And the king would say, "If you don't obey me, if you don't pay your taxes, if you don't serve me faithfully, then I will do to you what you did to those animals." Now I'm not making this up. the same thing shows up later in the Bible, and the passage is on the screen and in the sermon notes page. God says, the men who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces. The leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the court officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who walk between the pieces of the calf, I will hand over to their enemies who seek their lives. Their dead bodies will become food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Ew, youch. Kings meant business back then. You know, maybe we don't have it so bad today. I mean, not even the IRS is going to cut you in half. So now let's go back to Abram in the light of this little bit of trivia. God promises children. Abram believes and is declared righteous. He's on a roll. God promises land. And Abram, just 2 verses after his great faith makes him righteous, blows it and says, how do I know you're telling me the truth? And God responds, get the animals. Now, Abram didn't need a history lesson. He knew what that meant. And he knows that he is in deep trouble. Now imagine what's going through his mind as he spends the hours it would take to cut a cow, a sheep, and a goat in half without a chainsaw or an electric knife. And he's thinking, oh man, why did I not keep my mouth shut? And as he slops through the ooze of those carcasses with his heart in his throat, he's wondering how he's ever going to keep his part of the bargain. How he's going to stay perfectly faithful to a perfect God and holding in his hands the grisly foretaste of his fate when he doesn't. And even after he cuts the animals in two, he doesn't walk between the pieces. Can you blame him? He waits. He waits for God to speak. He waits until dark, and a deep dread comes over him as he's wondering and waiting for God to say, walk, Abram, and you better obey me or else. And finally, just after dark, God speaks. Your descendants will be slaves in a foreign country for 400 years. And Abram bows his head thinking, oh man, no, not my kids. They don't even exist yet. Please don't make them pay for my mistake. But God says, I will punish that nation, and your children will come out with great possessions. And Abram opens an eye and thinks, okay, at least they survive. And God continues, you will die at a ripe old age. And Abram looks up and thinks, this is getting better. And God finishes, this land will belong to your children. And Abram ventures a smile because, okay, now we're back to where we started when I shot off my mouth. I think I can handle this. I think I'm ready to walk. Because the promises of God are worth the cost of commitment. But before Abram can take his first step, a smoking fire pot passes between the halves of the dead animals. God does not ask Abram to walk because God himself walks between those pieces. Did you catch that? God himself walks between the pieces, which means, Abram, if you don't obey me, if you don't serve me faithfully, if you don't keep your end of the bargain perfectly, I will do to myself what you did to those animals. If you don't obey, if you don't serve me faithfully, if you ever sin, Abram, I will do to myself what you did to those animals. I will pay the penalty for your unfaithfulness. God promises himself as the offering for Abram's sin. God keeps his promises. As Jesus the Messiah, God did to himself what Abram did to those animals. He allowed his own body to be split by the lash, nailed to a cross, pierced with a spear for Abram's sin, but not for Abram's sin only, but for the sins of the whole world. Because God's covenant with Abram was not with Abram only. That covenant was with Abram and his wife and his children and all of their descendants, not just by blood, but also by faith. Abram's descendants are anyone, anywhere, anytime who believe God like Abram did. That includes us. As we trust God like Abram did, as we say yes to God as Abram did, as we believe God like Abram did, God credits it to us as righteousness, just as he did with Abram. God's promises to Abram become promises to us, and we, along with Abram, become God's friends and God's beloved children. We not only inherit God's promise to Abram, we are the fulfillment of that promise. We are part of that starry sky full of descendants that God promised to Abram. God keeps his promises. On the other hand, when we rupture our relationship with God, and that happens when we hurt God or people by what we've done or left undone, when we rupture our relationship with God, God is there for us and with us just as he was with Abram when Abram faltered. When we blow it like Abram did, when we doubt God's goodness, when we question his timing, when we suspect his motives, when we accuse him of mistreating us and not keeping his promises, when we are unfaithful, God stays faithful. He is always ready to forgive us, always invites us back into relationship with him, and he never does to us what Abram did to those animals, because God walked between the pieces, not Abram. In this season of Lent, the Sunday sermons are about living and dying well. Ash Wednesday reminded us, we are dust, and to dust we shall return. I'm going to die. We all are going to die. So let's do what it takes to die well. The best preparation for dying well is living well. And last Sunday, Father Andrew gave us some of the ingredients for living well: being in right relationship with God and people, accepting the protection that God offers us, resting in the knowledge that we are indeed saved, and resisting the devil's lies that tell us we aren't. And today, we hear how God has done his part, the hard part, to help us live well and in peace and in righteousness and right relationship with God. On the cross, God did to himself what Abram did to those animals. God himself paid the penalty for our sins and our unfaithfulness. And God's done his part to put us in right relationship with himself. Let's do ours. Let's trust God like Abram did. Let's say yes to God like Abram did. And let's choose to believe God as Abram did. And as we do, God declares us righteous just like he did with Abram. And God's promises to Abram become promises to us. And we, along with Abram, become God's friends and his beloved children.